Hello and welcome to CourtGames, a Legend of the Five Rings podcast funded by the Legend of the Five Rings Discord Patreon.
This podcast will focus on the role-playing game stories and lore for Legend of the Five Rings.
I'm Corvar.
I'm Kikita Kaori. And today for our podcast, we are going to talk about social contract theory because there's been a... Yes, I know. Because I'm a nerd. And also because there's been discussion on Discord recently where people are having trouble with players kind of getting into the samurai mindset and the idea of working for the establishment and so on. And I think a big part of that is just we don't talk about social contract theory very much anymore. But historically, even if they didn't use that term, it was a very fundamental part of kind of discussion or a way of thinking about the world. So we're going to try and, it certainly was very much on the minds of philosophers and writers during like the American Revolution and the founding of the United States on our side. And of course, that all came from, European thought. But those contracts, the idea of social contract theory is kind of a fundamental structure of the world that we just don't talk about right now. So I thought maybe we'd talk about that and talk about some basics of it and how it would apply to Rokugan and maybe something you can talk to your players about to see if it helps get them in the samurai mindset a little bit better.
This is all sort of why we're talking about this very abstract sounding philosophical thing. And it's essentially how to understand your character's relationship to the world and why they're doing what they're doing. So it is the whole point is to get something kind of concrete at the end of it, which is getting to understand why your character would do what they're asked to do and that sort of thing. So it does all make sense.
Yeah, but we have a little news.
Yeah. So the latest Daidoji Shin novel by Josh Reynolds is out, and this is The Flower Path, in which esteemed and very socially upright, Daidoji Shin, the dilettante. Well, his new hobby of setting up a kabuki theatre is having its grand opening, and I'm sure absolutely nothing will go wrong. Only something goes wrong, and it becomes a locked room mystery. Only it's more of a locked theatre mystery. And so that is out now wherever good books are sold.
So I enjoyed this. I'm not sure I enjoyed it more than the other two Daidoji Shin mysteries, though it was fun to see some characters that may come from the L5R card game show up in there. And I thought the mystery itself was fairly compelling at the end, at least the pieces of it. I didn't necessarily guess who it would be.
Yeah.
Which is always good.
I have to admit, I mostly enjoyed this, and the things I didn't like, one of them is a kind of nitpicky, and I suspect will be I deliberately made this choice to make, because this is the novel I wanted to write. And one is, I think, kind of not following the rules of murder mysteries. And I'm not... Yeah.
So what are the issues?
The main thing is that this is a kabuki theater, right? And kabuki never historically shared the same place in society that the theater does in Western society, in British and American. So the way I was thinking of it, if someone says, I'm going to go to the opera tonight, right? You're going to form a particular opinion about that sort of person, the sort of person who goes to the opera. And then you've got someone, and admittedly we don't really have this anymore. I think in America I would say vaudeville, or possibly even burlesque. If someone's going, I'm going to the vaudeville show, you've got a particular opinion on who that person is. In Britain, I'd say music hall. right? But if someone says, I'm going to the theatre, right, that's a kind of middle ground between those two. Like the opera is your rich people and your very educated people and, the kind of the jet set. And vaudeville and burlesque and music hall, those are your, the lower class, working class people, right? And the theatre can be middle class. Someone with aspirations, a working class person with aspirations might saying, I'm going to the theatre, right? But, the upper crust would entirely happily go to the theatre and that sort of thing. And kabuki just never was that. Kabuki was lower class.
That was No, wasn't it?
No is the opera in that sense. That's where where socially it fits. I mean, they're both music and dancing in a way, but No is for the upper class and the upper crust, right? There were shoguns who performed No and were obsessed by No, and that was perfectly fine and lovely. But honestly, the great and the good, who are the people that Daidoji Shin interacts with, and we're talking children of clan champions and, representatives to the city of the Rich Frog, which is one of the richest places in Rokugan and very important, they would not be seen dead going to kabuki. Right. There isn't that middle. But I think what was going for is that very, I would almost say 1920s Playboy detective theater story. And I totally get that. And this is what this is. This is what it ends up being.
It certainly had a Globe Theater vibe per Shakespeare with your groundlings and your booths.
I think it was closer to that, yeah.
In the book. But I did have a question with that in regards to like 47 Ronin and the climax of that. Was that kabuki or no?
That's kabuki and bunraku, the puppet plays.
All right, that's what I thought. Right, and that was being performed for the upper crust. So he may have been getting it from some other source.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that, because I just don't think it quite, I don't think there is anything that quite fits where this novel is set, if you like.
It's a unique Rokugan thing for the Rokugan found in the Daidoji Shin books.
I mean, I'm sure that is literally it, but it was just a nitpick. And I mean, it's unfortunate. Unfortunately, it's a nitpick that like is going throughout the entire book, which is unfortunate. But I mean, I love the characters and I love all the other things and the ins and outs. And Daidoji Shin is a delight, as is his bodyguard, and that kind of friend. And there's another bodyguard who shows up, and there's this interesting back and forth between the two of them, which I thought was really. I mean, there's lots of good stuff. And it's very difficult to talk about my other problem without spoiling the entire book, which I don't want to do.
Oh, well, maybe some other time then. But go ahead and ask. Go and ask Kovar online.
Yeah, once you've read it yourself, because I don't want to spoil it for you. I really don't, because there's a lot to like. And if you don't care about that thing I care about, and it's entirely fair, if you think, no, I don't care, I want Kabuki to be that kind of thing where the great and the good can go to the booths and stuff, and the common people can be in the crowd. Go for it. I mean, the rest of the writing is lovely. The characters are great, and it was compelling. It was compelling to read through. So, I mean, I'm a picky guy. So,
All right. Well, I guess we have to now go on to talk about social contract theory because, expose my nerdiness. So, as I said, this has been a recurring topic on Discord and other areas where people discuss L5R. Basically, samurai society is feudal and it's basically undefensible by modern standards. Absolutely. I would not want to live there on any side of it. You would not want a modern society set up this way. This tends to lead to players having a hard time getting into a samurai mindset or a circumstance at all where they could see a peasant rebellion as not being the good thing, defensible.
And I have always said it is really interesting that none of us ever talk about any other game setting like this.
Yeah, not really, no. But it does get to this broader concept of how our society is created and how are they sustained. And that kind of leads to this idea of social contract theory. So we'll talk about that.
Right. So I think we do need to kind of start off by saying we're not sociologists or philosophers or historians or anything like that. And the whole point is to simplify this and apply it specifically to Rock Again, to your game that you're playing. So, don't take this as any kind of like textbook or anything like that.
Or expect us to argue with you about it, because you might be a historian or a philosopher and we're not. And so we might get aspects of this wrong. And, it's like,
yeah,
that's fine. All right. The basics of social contract theory is this idea that social groups are created when a generally or unwritten or unspoken contract is formed between individual members of a group and the group itself. So that kind of unstated, unwritten contract is called the social contract. And there's three basic kinds of social contract. There's a familial social contract, a tribal social contract, and a governmental social contract. There might be other kinds, but those are the three we're gonna talk about today. I think all three of those are important for understanding the structure of Rokugan and the various allegiances and loyalties and issues that samurai have in society, because those three contracts don't have to agree with each other. And when a social contract is systematically broken, group cohesion eventually fails, and the organization, whatever it is, the family, the tribe, or government, falls apart. And this leads to chaos and insecurity and a lot of other problems. So that's that. Do you have any thoughts on kind of what a social contract is on your side?
Whether necessarily this is how people think about it is one thing. But yeah, I think these ideas are pretty strong. And it is possible for the familial, tribal, and governmental, these social contracts to create interesting conflicts for your game. Mm-hmm. And any stories you may wish to tell within Rock Again. So this is one of the reasons why we want to do this, is to take all this theory and make it into interesting stuff for your game.
At least give you the tools to think about it that way, So the earliest kind of social contract to form within an area, kind of the most basic structure, is the familial social contract. This is based on a family. It's people united by blood. The core contract, then, of the familial social contract is that older generations will care for and raise younger generations who will, in turn, care for and support the older generations. Mm-hmm. Right? So in human societies, this tends to work on a kind of a 3-generation system. You have the oldest generation, which is kind of the grandparents, if you want to think. Their job to the familial unit is to give wisdom and guidance, and they also give an inheritance. So that means that, over their lives, they've acquired stuff that they will, in turn, pass on to the younger generations with their death or before their death. In return for passing their inheritance and giving wisdom and guidance, they get support and respect and reverence from the younger generations back. The middle generation is the parents. They give their labor and support and defense to both the older generations and the younger generations. These are the people who are most physically capable, intellectually capable of providing for the family unit. They build the inheritance of the family unit. In return, they receive guidance from the older generation and they get the inheritance. Anything the older generation has built, they get to control. and they are supposed to get, in particular, respect from the younger generation. And then the youngest generation are the children, and they're supposed to give respect and obedience to the older generations, and then they receive, in turn, support, education, guidance, and defense from the older generations, along with the promise of inheritance someday. That's the core thing. Parents take care of kids, and then kids grow up to take care of parents and sustain the family unit by having kids of their own, so that the contract keeps passing from one generation to the next.
And the thing you need to keep in mind is that this tends to be extended families living together. I think we are, in the modern day, very used to parents and kids, and that's it, the nuclear family. But you can end up with your grandparents and all their kids, the aunts and uncles, as well as your parents. And then there's you and all your cousins. And they become kind of this bigger family than just a nuclear family. And that can be a little bit different to what we're used to.
Right. How much support goes outside of that nuclear core varies by society. But the kind of, even in the nuclear family, the contract is still the same.
Depending on precisely what kind of society you've got, when we say, the older generation give guidance to the younger generation, that can be really strict. And the Rokugani society is more along that side of the gradient there. They're kind of, the older members of the family have a lot of sway over what the youngers should do, which leads on to our next little topic here, is because there can be other provisions in it that have been added into, like tradition or just the family structure. So certain family members can be required to follow particular courses of study. I mean, I think we're all familiar with the stereotypical you must be a doctor or a lawyer kind of thing. And in Rokugan, it's you will follow this path. You will follow in the tradition of your father. You will go to the dojo that your mother attended. This is where you're going. This is what you're learning. You can end up with very strict gender norms, not necessarily. And I think our modern FFG Rokugan is a bit more forgiving. But in some societies, it's very clear. Boys do this. Girls do this. That's it.
Right. Now, as you said, FFG is much more forgiving, and it's not as expected. But definitely, that is a change from Japanese behavior. By gender norms, that could be something like, women are required to wear this clothing and men wear this clothing, and women are required to do this at this age, including marriage. Men are required to do that. These very, very strict definitions of the gender norms are very common in families.
Yeah, it can vary from family to family, but also society to society. So if you particularly want to have that as a conflict for a character, then your character's family might be very strict. If that's a thing you want to introduce, yeah.
Right. Rokugan as a whole, in FFG verse, doesn't have it, but a family absolutely could.
Yeah.
If you want that.
And a final thing that might crop up is this family that we're talking about for your character, a particular family, may forbid family members from pursuing certain activities or associating with certain people. So, you can't talk to that lot. We're feuding with this other group. No son of mine will open the Tower of Shinsei, that kind of thing, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Now, in our modern society, the idea of adding these provisions above, you love and care for your parents and you love and care for your children, is considered almost always bad. It's just not done.
It certainly happens in the real world.
It certainly happens in the real world. It's, whether we consider it good or bad, like I said, it's almost always considered bad. It happens today. It's very regular. So, and it always has.
I don't want to limit some, because some people immediately, because I suddenly realized that I was talking about when I was talking about you're a doctor or you're a lawyer, it's a very traditional stereotype of the Asian tiger mom, right? But it's not like Western families don't do the exact same thing.
Oh, absolutely. No son of mine is going to be a garbage man. No,
And sometimes no son of mine is going to college. You're not going to become one of those,
Right.
Those fancy, people with their $10 words. How dare you? You're going down the mines.
Right. Or vice versa. All my children will go to college. Or, there's certain professions that are just completely off bar that have nothing to do with, the tiger mom stereotype. You could probably find some aspect of it in your own families if you look hard enough. And for anyone who's had familial trauma, I am sorry if we raised it.
I'm just going to add one other note here, which is an L5R terminology thing. When we're talking about families here, we're talking about not the capital F great clan family thing, because those are enormous organizations with thousands upon thousands of people. We're talking about one person, their parents, their grandparents, right? This is like a small F family, although I'm sure to the person in it, it's a capital F. If you see what I mean. But, it's not like the Daidoji family. It's this group of people who live in this house and possibly this kind of collection.
Yes, even when they're apart from each other, they don't need to live together. It's this relationship by immediate blood. So there are limits to the family relationship. We've talked about some ways that requirements that they have provisions that are in the structure, but there's also limits. It does require membership in the family group through very specific channels. Normally it's like birth to pay off death. That's the obvious one. It's very slow to introduce new members to the group, especially if introducing them not as part of the youngest generation. Because it is generational, that means there's a long time from the costs going into the benefits. I mean, a baby doesn't provide much to the family in and of themselves.
Yeah,
right?
Stupid babies.
So the rest of the family doesn't get a lot. They don't get a lot of benefit from that. And it could take years before that addition pays off. So, and then you get to the middle generation where they feel the costs. They're doing all the work, but they don't necessarily feel like they're getting any benefits. They're not relaxing. They haven't done it. They feel like they've been working. They're not getting much wisdom from the older generations or anything that they value highly, but they're putting in a lot of labor at that stage. And then the oldest generation receives all the benefits, but if they haven't paid into the family, they don't necessarily have the costs, if that makes sense. So it's hard to introduce somebody at an old age to a family because they haven't fulfilled their side of the social contract. It's hard to introduce somebody who would be a vulnerability into the family. And so this gets to the concept of marriage, because that's bringing somebody from these middle generations from one family group to another.
This can also refer to adult adoption, although that's a slightly different thing. So essentially in a marriage, you've got a person who's just, they're moving from being a child who has no rights and some responsibilities, but they have very little fit. They're moving into that middle generation where they get now expected to really kind of work for the family, and they're moving from one family group to another, and that obviously changes things. So in a very strong family-oriented society, there's often a lot of, we're going to really make sure we know who's coming in, and we're going to take a while to know them, and so on and so on and so forth. So these things can take a while. Very often, because they're essentially leaving their home, their original family, and moving into a new one. So they are losing the inheritance that they would have gotten had they stayed with their original family. But that means they often get that as a dowry to take with them to the new family, depending on exactly the social set up, they may take it back if there's a divorce. Because sometimes there's another thing where if a lower class person, when I say lower class, it's depending on how the family they're marrying into, what do they see? How do they see this person? They may see that person as not bringing as much to the table as they could be. And sometimes the dowry is to kind of make up that difference, which sounds really terrible. Like none of this, but I love him. Yeah, but no, he's going to have to pay his way if he's going to come into our family. Like that's a very foreign concept.
Right. If that person's a liability, if we had raised this person, we would have done these things to them so that they would be a good resource for us later on. But we didn't raise them, and you over there raised them, and they are not as good as our children, and therefore now they're a liability. So we need some extra to make up for the fact that we're going to now have this less than adequate person coming in.
It sounds very restrictive, right? And I think it makes a lot of sense when we think if we're imagining like a middle class society, a middle class family who, they're doing more like a clerical job or something along those lines. Most of the characters we'll be playing will be kind of in this middle class and even upper class, honestly. But a lot of this stuff happens from families that are like, you can imagine a farming or hunter-gatherer family where you have mouths to feed and you must directly work to get food or everyone starves to death. And so you can have situations where there are lots of children in the family at the minute, which means there are lots of mouths to feed, but there's not that much labor, either hunting or farming or whatever it is. You have other situations where the children are now of an age where they can do chores and they can help. They're still living with the family. The oldest generation, they're still pretty hale and active. So now we've got loads of labor. We've got loads of people coming in and getting stuff done. But then the grandparents are getting older and the young adults are now marrying and leaving. And so suddenly this family has much less and it can be very cyclical. And this is why stuff like this becomes very important. And even when the society starts to move on technologically, and you have people who don't need to literally worry about where the next meal's coming from, even if they don't directly work for their food, those attitudes are still there. That's why this stuff's so very important, because it feels like the family could literally fail to function and could literally just not have enough food.
Mm-hmm. How are family contracts enforced? So most major religions of the world, and definitely something like Confucianism, have kind of honor your father and mother clauses in one sense or another, because, religion carries the role of teaching the values from the older generation onto the younger generation. It's one of the things religion does, is try and give these values to the next generation. And therefore, the worries and the concerns of the people passing it on are the older generation. That's why religions tend to have the honor your father and mother and not the, you'd think would be really important, but not included, the don't abuse your children clause, which should be there. But
it really should.
It really should, but it isn't. Because religion is passed through in the family contract from the older generation to the younger generation, and the older generation is more concerned about being taken care of, and they know they don't need to be told by anybody to do it. Or this is the older generation thinking. It's educating the young to do their responsibilities, to live up to the contract. So there's spiritual enforcement there for the family social contract. Many tribal or governmental social contracts include enforcement provisions to compel the enforcement of familial social contracts. And you'll think that's oppression, right? Messing with my family, except every law against child abuse, every law requiring child support, all of those are enforcement to familial social contracts, basically.
And it can be as subtle as those looks your family gets from their neighbors.
Your tribe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the people around you are going to have opinions about how you're being raised and how you're raising your kids and how you're doing stuff. And that's a really, really important thing, especially because each family group is very likely, certainly back in the subsistence hunter-gatherer / farming days, you rely on those folks, on those bits, those years where you have less labor because the kids are still growing up. You take from them, and when you're richer because you've got more labor because the kids are grown up and they're helping, you help them. It's really important what their opinion is of you.
Mm-hmm. And all of this family group thing, we do have human bonds. There is supposed to be love between your parent and child, and that should be reciprocated in healthy relationships. It's not a given,
sadly,
unfortunately, but it is a part of the enforcement mechanism that keeps this whole thing running. So we wanted to mention.
You do have to think about, it is terrible the way parents have such control over their children. But you do have to remember that, children can be idiots. They can, like I certainly was. And, you need to stop them from running out on the road in the path of that, vehicle, whether it be a horse or a car or whatever. You need to stop them from grabbing the sharp objects. You need to stop them from burning the house down, So there is that thing where you have to enforce control because they don't yet know enough to be left unsupervised. It's just, when does that stop? When does that change? And that's something that's very different from society to society.
Mm-hmm, but it's all happening in this whole familial social contract.
The ideal is I exert control over my children so that they can learn, and when they are ready, they will be able to make their own decisions, and they'll have all the tools that they need. That's the ideal. It's just not necessarily, that isn't always what happens.
Right. It's sometimes broken.
And that is an issue. So the next section, having talked about how these bonds work and how they're enforced and all that sort of stuff, what happens when this breaks down? And generally the older family members, generally they're the patriarch or the matriarch, depending. They're generally the ones who decide if the contract has been broken. Older generations generally can't be pushed out. That's almost never done. But they can end up being basically sidelined by the younger generation.
So yeah, if you have a person who is old now, considering they have already fulfilled their part of the contract for the most part with their labor during their middle generation years, but now they're not providing wisdom. Now they're being wasteful with resources or foolish or something, not normally just sick, but like a liability.
Being overly autocratic or whatever, yeah.
Right. The rest of the family can basically cocoon them, just keep them from the information that they need, keep them out of sight, and otherwise, ignore them. That's what happens with the older generations.
Yeah, it's you don't quite get put in a home, but you get to stay in your room or maybe go out on the balcony, but you don't have any actual power anymore. For younger generations, certainly the younger they are, or at least the younger middle generation, and kind of the ones who the less you kind of married and have kids of your own. If you're just one of the younger generation, you can be disinherited or exiled. It's less likely for young children, but someone who's no longer a child officially and is supposed to be working and contributing, but they're not, or they're considered to have broken the contract in some other ways, they can just be disinherited and exiled. You are no longer part of this family, kind of deal. Away with you. That's certainly a thing that can happen. That's less likely to happen with younger children, but various unpleasant things can happen to younger children who are considered to have broken the social contract.
Right. That's a big weakness in the very youngest, and this has been true for every society for all of time. Unfortunately, the very youngest have no recourse within the family to if the family breaks a social contract with them, as in not provide their care, education. They have no recourse, and that's why child abuse is such an invisible and terrible problem, because there's no appeal in the family structure, really.
Having said that, the young person, at a certain point, they're going to be able to then, instead of being exiled or disinherited, they can leave voluntarily. They can exile themselves, which means that they then deny the family defense and labor.
Right. If they can make it to adulthood, they can pick up and leave. And then the family has put in some portion or the portion of work on the child, but hasn't gotten the benefit of their labor. So it's just the way it works. So how does this translate to Rokugan? Well, we certainly have already talked that this is family like household family or immediate biological family. In Rokugan, every samurai is going to have obligations to their parents and to their children if they have them.
And if not their own children, they're going to have brothers and sisters. They're going to have nephews and nieces. They're going to have cousins who are, of the younger generation. So they'll be almost certainly, it's not absolutely true because it depends on the individual. Like the Dragon Clan are having a birth rate crisis. So maybe it's like, no, it is just you. it's just you. There's no one younger than you in this family. This is just it. But other than that, it is very common, even if you don't have, your characters not have children of their own, there may well be younger members of your extended family who you have obligations to.
Right. As a player, you're playing an adult, pretty much, unless you're playing a very different kind of game. An adult, and you're not playing a venerable, aged adult. So you are playing basically the middle generation here. That means you are expected to support and defend your children or the children of your family, and you are expected to respect and care for your parents and the older generation of your family. Pretty much always. You can't just forget them. As a GM working with your players, you need to figure out what beyond that base social expectation for the family a particular character's family structure might impose upon them. So we talked about there are these other provisions in the family that if you're part of a family, you have to follow. What are they? It's not arbitrary, but that's something as a player you want to figure. Is there any other family obligations that my particular family is going to impose on this structure? It might not be something you want to deal with, but it's certainly a place for Ninyo and Giri and all kinds of story hooks and stuff. Is your particular social family obligations in your family contract.
I think it might be a thing for a lot of people. One of the difficulties people have with the character generation in FFG's Edge Studios, our current Legend of Five Rings role-playing game, is Ninja and Giri, especially Giri, because I just kind of think, surely my Giri is just what my daimyo tells me to do. But I think a good source of Giri, as in the thing you write down on your character sheet, right, is a family obligation. So like your daimyo saying, go and, be part of this delegation, or go investigate this thing that's going on. But your giddy that you write down could be, you must make a good match because your family needs you to get a good marriage, right? And that's a perfectly valid giddy. It's nothing to do with your daimyo. Daimyo's got nothing to do with that. But it's a family giddy that you've got to deal with. And your ninja might be just, I don't want to get married, or I want to marry someone I love rather than someone who's a good match, or I actually want to be ambitious and I don't really care about my marriage. Or another potential giddy is you must get ahead. You must, in order to provide for the family and do your job, you've got to get yourself a good prestigious appointment. And that could be a good giddy. And that's, again, not from your daimyo, that's from your family.
Right. So I strongly encourage GMs and players to sit to take a moment and think about whether there are any of these additional provisions in your particular family contract, that you're working with. But that's one kind of contract. So the next kind of contract I wanted to talk about.
So that's been our topic for now. This has been talking about the social contract theory and how that will apply to RockGen. And like has been said, we hope you find this useful. We'd like to call out our sister podcast and our Patreons. So we'll call out to Fortune and Strife, our affiliated actual play podcast, currently on medical hiatus, but fingers crossed, soon. And we must also shout out our friends at D20 Radio, who have a huge amount of role-playing game related podcasts. So there's something in there for anyone at D20 Radio.
Our content is funded by the Community Discord Patreon, which supports our editing costs, as well as our website, where you can see and store some longer-term information, summary of our podcasts, the results of our competitions that we've had, one-page adventures, all kinds of other RPG tools, and more. For our patrons, we will have special bonus content like Adventure Seeds, early access to our AP podcasts, and other things as we think of them. Online, you can find us at CourtGamesPod.com, at Twitter.com/CourtGamesPod, and on Patreon at Patreon.com/CourtGames. But that is it for us this week. This is Kakita Kaori. May the fortunes favor you.
And I have been Korvar, and until we meet again, keep your jade handy.
Correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.